Well, good morning, and it's good to be with you again for this fifth talk. Welcome to those who are listening online or on Zoom. We have an important topic to discuss today. Matthew 5, verses 27 through to 30 deal with a fundamental question of integrity. About 10 years ago, I was leading a charity called Jubilee Plus. And I invited somebody who I hadn't met to be a guest speaker at a conference to be held in Manchester. He was recommended to me. And his name was Ian Henderson. And I went up to meet Ian in Manchester before the conference, a few months before the conference, in order to get to know him and to brief him about the conference. We had a great conversation about the conference. He was an evangelist, very talented evangelist, working in inner city Manchester with a project known as the Message Trust and the Eden Project. He was recommended to me as a great speaker, and indeed he was. So we talked about his work, and he said to me at the very end, just as we were leaving, "By the way, I'm changing jobs." And I said, "Really? What are you going to do?" He said, "I'm going to set up a charity to challenge and deal with the issue of pornography, especially in the church." I could have fallen off my chair with surprise. And I said, "Ian, why on earth would you do that?" And he told me this story. In September 2007, he received a phone call from a member of his family, a Christian family, came from a Christian family, concerning his father, who was a deacon in the church and a pillar of the church that they were in. And this phone call said, "Ian, your dad has just been arrested for possession of child pornography." It was a stunning blow. And it turned out that this middle-aged man had hidden a pornography addiction from his family and from everybody else in the church for over 20 years. And his addiction had got worse and worse over time till he was arrested. It was a bombshell in his family. He was subsequently convicted, but by the time he came to conviction, he was also ill with cancer, and he died 3 weeks after his conviction from cancer. And ever since that moment, Ian had been living with this story and the thought of the significance of it, and he felt one day God called him and spoke to him and said, "Ian, you can do something about this. I'm calling you to do something about this." And so he set up a charity known as the Naked Truth Project, which has grown and grown in influence and significance ever since those days, about 10 years ago. And I said, "Ian, I will pray for you regularly." And he's been on my prayer list for the last 10 years because he's taken on a really hard job. Almost at exactly the same time as these events were happening in 2007, Steve Jobs, the CEO of Apple, stood up at a media event in California and very proudly held up a new phone. You can see it on the screen, a phone not dissimilar to the one that I have here. This is not a marketing exercise, by the way. And Steve Jobs said, "I've been looking forward to this for 2.5 years. Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone." And so the smartphone was born. The phone which is also a computer. The phone that takes computing away from the desktop, from the laptop, into your pocket, into your hands, wherever you go, In the privacy of your life, you have the world connected to you through the smartphone. It was a technological revolution of staggering implications. But one of the implications was that it gave people everywhere the opportunity to engage in negative and unhelpful sexual behavior with privacy on an unprecedented scale in human history. Pornography, a key example. Online dating apps of every sort and online communities of every sort led to the proliferation across the world of irresponsible sexual behavior through the advent of technological access through the smartphone. It was an accidental development of what was a very smart technical development, which has many positives to it. And so it was another step forward in the sexualization of society. And this wasn't just happening in the West, because all over the world, the smartphone is changing people's lives. This is true in Asia, this is true in Africa, this is true in Latin America, in poor countries. People seek smartphones as much as they seek them in rich countries. And so we live in an astonishingly sexualized society. You know that. But sometimes we need to take stock. Last week, when I looked at the top 15 most used websites worldwide, and they vary from time to time, but in the top 15, 3 are devoted entirely to pornography. And all those 3 are used roughly as much as Amazon in each case. We live in a sex-saturated society, and it eats away at the integrity of the Christian community in many different ways. And sometimes we come across tragic circumstances, as I did a couple of years ago, where even a Christian leader, a friend of mine in another continent, coming up towards retirement, had an affair, destroyed his ministry, destroyed his family, destroyed his reputation, and set the kingdom back. The stakes are high. And because we're in the Sermon on the Mount, as I warned you last week, Jesus goes straight to the point. And we looked last week at the issue of anger, a very important issue. And now we're going to look at the issue of integrity in our relationships. Verses 27 to 28. You've heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Lust basically means trying to take hold of something that doesn't belong to you. And Jesus was underlying the importance of the 10 Commandments. Do you remember we discussed which commandments come forward from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant? Only the ones that are formally reinstated, and the adultery command is reinstated as part of our Christian obedience. But Jesus here isn't particularly talking about the act of adultery, serious though it is. He's pointing out that underlying that is an attitude of heart, wanting what does not belong to you. And the context that he was talking in could hardly be more different from the context I've just described in Western society. Here you are in conservative Jewish society, where there's no freedom for sex outside marriage. There are no gay relationships. Divorce is relatively rare. It's a very conservative society in terms of its sexual ethics, but Jesus said that's not wholly what matters. What matters is what's going on in the human heart. Even in a conservative society, where everything looks fine, Jesus says under the surface, men and indeed women, he focuses on men here, but the same applies to women, what's going on in their hearts really matters. And so we find the Sermon on the Mount, as in almost every area that we look at, is setting the bar incredibly high. Jesus is forming the Christian community, and he wants it to be incredibly distinctive and vigorous, morally and ethically, in terms of its behavior in its community, in order to influence the world. And it turns out that sexual ethics is a key part of it, not the only part of it, but it is a key part of it. And this talk and the next talk cover different aspects of that particular topic. And I'm absolutely unashamed in talking about it. I'm not embarrassed talking about it, because we need to talk as honestly as Jesus talks, don't we? We need to live in integrity, and we can do that, and there's much grace to do that. We've spoken a lot about grace this morning, and I'll tell you a bit more about it later on. But it's the next two verses that are really challenging. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. These are the sort of verses that preachers like to avoid. Now, immediately he says that, we're shocked. Are you shocked? It's pretty shocking, isn't it? And the most obvious cynical thought is, well, if I take my right eye out, I've still got my left eye. Jesus, it turns out, isn't talking literally. He's using a technique which we know as hyperbole. He's using an exaggerated example in order to make a really powerful point. And the really powerful point is, if there's an issue here, you have to be radical. He uses these kind of hyperboles in all sorts of different situations. For example, a couple in the Sermon on the Mount, just to give you an idea of this form of writing. Matthew 6, verse 3, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing when you're giving to the poor. What does that mean? Your left hand doesn't know what your right hand's doing. It's a metaphorical form of speech, isn't it? Jesus often uses this. Matthew 7, here's another one. Verse 3, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? He's obviously not talking literally, is he? There's no plank in your eye that I can see. So here we have this same form of speech, a dramatic statement to get your attention and make a point, which is that in terms of sexual integrity, if there's an issue you're facing, there's only one solution: be radical and deal with it directly. This is what Joseph did in the Old Testament. Joseph in the book of Genesis. You remember the story, a man who had such an up and down life with all sorts of suffering and difficulties and ended up being prime minister of Egypt. And there's an interesting story like halfway along the line where he's a servant in the household of a man called Potiphar, who is a senior official in the government, close to the Pharaoh. And he's responsible for running the household. He's a very responsible man, so he's promoted to the top of the tree of the servants in the household. Potiphar's often away on business, and his wife takes a fancy to Joseph. Genesis 39. And what is Joseph's response? He resisted her advances And it says he didn't even want to be in the same room with her on his own in the house. And eventually, when she pushed the issue, he ran out the house to get away. He took a radical view that he did not want to go down this road. We don't know what his feelings were. Maybe he felt some attraction towards her, but he knew it was wrong. He took radical action to deal with this issue. And this is the biggest point I'm going to make today. If you are facing an issue in this area, be radical. I've told this story once before, but a few years ago, but I think it's appropriate to tell it again, and forgive me for repeating myself. But about 20 years ago, I visited some friends of mine in another city, a couple with children who I've known for many, many years. I was in business, passing through, stayed the night. We were talking socially, and the husband suddenly said to me very unexpectedly, "Can we just go for a walk?" There was a park nearby, so off we went. He said, "I just need to talk to you about something." And he told me about a woman he'd met at work, the attraction he felt, the options he had, the offer she'd made, the possibilities that lay before him. A committed Christian, this man. He was troubled, in two minds, but significantly tempted to abandon his family. And we went through a conversation much like we're having now. And I was very clear with him. You've got to run. Run quick. Got to deal with this fast, or it'll destroy you. And he did. He ran fast. He didn't go down that road. And if I phone him up today, I can visit the same home, same family, same marriage. It's secured. But he had to take a big decision and not fall into a trap. Jesus was unambiguous. And in our culture, we've idolized freedom, casual sex, the issue of that consent is all that matters. We've glorified what the Bible calls lust, which is seeking to have something that doesn't belong to you, seeking to have something that doesn't belong to you. So we have to be really countercultural. And that's what I'm encouraging us to be. In this area, as in many others, such as the area of anger that we spoke of last week. So for those who've been down this road in one form or another and are struggling, is there a way back? Yes, there's always a way back. Has an unforgivable sin been committed in this area? No. The unforgivable sin is not in this area. There is always a way back. But pride and shame and fear and secrecy hold people in bondage. It's always better to face the music. There's nothing unforgivable. We can return. Let me tell you the greatest return story of the Bible in respect to this issue, and you probably can imagine what I'm going to talk to you about. This is where I'm going to finish this talk. But I want to just go through a little bit of the story of King David in the Old Testament. A man given incredible privilege by God, a powerful ruler, strong family, strong organization of his country, great respect, who one day, while he was kind of just relaxing, went on to the top part of his palace in Jerusalem, and just by chance, he happened to view a woman who was bathing on the roof of her house, bearing in mind a Mediterranean-type climate, the use of the flat roofs as part of the living area of the house. He didn't know who this woman was. And if you look at the geography and the topography of Jerusalem, there's hills in Jerusalem. And where David's palace might have been positioned is in quite a high position. So when it says that he looked and he saw, he probably had the advantage of height to look down on the houses around and look, and he could see the tops of the houses. But he made a big mistake. When he saw, here's his big mistake. He investigated. He sent people to find out, who is this woman? That was the first step downhill. And then, of course, he invited her over, and her name was Bathsheba, and they committed adultery. And his sin was found out by the influence of a prophet called Nathan, who had a revelation about what David had done. Was there any way back? It had been revealed. It was in the public. Was he going to have to resign as king? Was he going to have to give up going into the temple and joining the priests in leading the worship? Was he going to be rejected by God? Was there a way back? Thank God there was a way back for King David. He knew that God was a just and righteous God, but he also knew that he was a God of mercy to those who called out to him. He knew, he had a tremendous depth of spiritual knowledge, and he was shocked at what he'd done. He was horrified to realize that in a casual moment he was about to throw away all the great things that he'd achieved in his life. And he, being a sincere worshipper who'd made a real error for which he was responsible, was able to know that he could come to God and find grace and forgiveness. And this story is recorded for us in Psalm 51, of which I will read a portion. There is always a way back. Have mercy on me, O God. According to your unfailing love, according to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions. Wash away all my iniquity and cleanse me from sin. When I read the word mercy, it often makes me very emotional when I'm preaching. I believe in a merciful God. I really believe in his mercy. That enables me to be merciful to other people because he's been merciful to me. And David knew that the starting point was to say, Lord, have mercy on me. Forgive me. And he knew that God was merciful. He knew that it wasn't a vain prayer. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is always before me. Against you, you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. So you're right in your verdict and justified when you judge. Surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me. Yet you desired faithfulness, even in the womb. You taught me wisdom in that secret place. Here is the absolutely vital truth that when we sin in any way, but let's just take this example of sexual sin, we're sinning against God as well as against other people. We have to grasp that and think, which is more important to me? My relationship with God or the indulgence of my current feelings and preferences and desires? And of course, people who are trapped in sexual sin, they shut down spiritually. The lights go out. There's a reason for that. It affects our relationship with God. Cleanse me with hyssop, and I will be clean. Wash me, and I'll be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones you've crushed rejoice. Hide your face from my sins and blot out my iniquity. He understood substitution and atonement. That God has the power to blot out sins. Say, not just I've forgiven you, but I've forgotten. It's gone out of the data record. Don't need GDPR for this. God's greater than GDPR. He can erase data more quickly than the press of a button on your computer. What's forgiven is dealt with forever, never to be brought up again by the Almighty. The sinner is free. We spoke about freedom in our singing. This is what we're talking about. Not to be controlled by our pasts. In this area, as in any other area, it applies equally to any area of life, but this is the most difficult one for many Christians to navigate. And then, movingly, and I'm thinking of the life of King David, and it's making me very emotional to think of it. Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Do not cast me from your presence or take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation and grant me a willing spirit to sustain me. He wanted a change of heart. It's only a change of heart that deals with these kind of things, not just a cosmetic change of actions. Renew a steadfast spirit within me. Get me organized and orderly in my life so I don't sit there gazing at things I shouldn't gaze at in idle moments from the roof of my palace, is basically what he means. And then finally, beautifully, restore to me the joy of your salvation and grant me a willing spirit to sustain me. And do you know what? God answered that prayer. Because David carried on reigning and ruling. He carried on writing psalms. He carried on administering the kingdom. There was a price to pay. His life was never the same again because the influence of his actions and the baby that was born and the husband of Bathsheba who he got killed, all those things, the consequences were still there. But spiritually, he was set free. And he reigned for many more years. Now let's zoom out for a moment as we come to conclusion this morning. Let me just say, if this raises something that you need to talk to someone about, talk to a friend or a member of our pastoral staff. But let's zoom out. Is this really feasible, this radical lifestyle of the Sermon on the Mount? Do you remember I said to you before that the Catholic Church thought it couldn't possibly be applicable to the ordinary people, only to the priests and the monks and the nuns? That Luther had his doubts about whether it was feasible. But let me tell you, yes, it is feasible. This is the Christian life. And one of the remarkable things about the early church is although it went totally counterculturally in terms of sexual ethics, and we'll discuss that more next week, the church grew rapidly across the Roman Empire. And as historians have looked at the reasons why the church grew so rapidly from a tiny sect to a multi-million member community across all aspects of the Roman Empire, one of the things they pinpointed is that the sexual ethics and the belief in the family and the support of marriage and the respect for people who are single, the support of widows, the discouragement of divorce, the discouragement of infanticide and casual sexual relationships was a big draw for people coming into the church. Because deep down, maybe people are actually looking more than we realize for a different way of living that's safer, stronger, more enduring, more fulfilling than the type of lifestyles that many people are adopting in society today. Shockingly, government national statistics, the best data we have of the last 3 decades, tell us that the quality of sexual relationships across the UK statistically is declining fast. Shockingly, the best data and research that we have tell us that loneliness is rising dangerously across our country. Not just because people are living longer, but some research indicates that one of the loneliest groups in our society are young adults. The very ones who have all this relational freedom and opportunity. We need to start telling a better story. There's a better way. And it's the way of Jesus, the way of the Sermon on the Mount.